Hi, everybody. So sorry I couldn't be with you all in person. I'm exceedingly jealous, but I'm gonna try to couch that a little bit for the next little while. What I want to start us off with is giving a little bit of background to sea autonomy, both theoretical and kind of the practical side. So on the theoretical side, I want to say what kind of a project sea autonomy is and what motivations there are for such a project and why we think it's important. And then we also want to know, we're going to try to explain what our practice has been like. How does sea autonomy actually work in terms of our workflow? And I'm also going to give a little bit of history of how our community has developed over the past 8, 9 years or so. So the motivations. So if both scientific theories and methods of their evaluation change through time, are there any underlying mechanism that govern these changes? Are there patterns through which scientific elements like theories and methods change through time, or is it just really kind of a chaotic mess? Our project started with the optimism that there are patterns that can be detected about how theories and methods have changed through time. The exact content of them you're going to hear more about in Hackup's talk. Now, there has been quite a bit said, both by philosophers and historians, about how scientific theories and methods change through time. But there's a question about how we can evaluate such claims without cherry picking. So everybody here who has a familiarity with HPS knows that one of the dominant approaches has been through case studies. And one worry about case studies is that you can just pick one or two that are convenient for a claim that you want to make that aren't genuinely representative. So that's one worry that I'm going to try to talk about how sea autonomy tries to overcome. And finally, there have been individual heroic efforts to understand scientific change. And despite like how what we admire and some of the great historical figures of our discipline, we don't think that this individualistic approach is the best option, and rather a communal approach is required. And if we're going to do these things together as a community, what implications does this have for how our practice ought to be structured? So it's a sunny day, presumably in Portugal, and we get a conversation between two of the greats of our field. One, Thomas Kuhn, who famously claimed that history of science is instrumental for understanding how science changes through time. His landmark structure of scientific revolution was crucial for initiating the so-called historical turn in philosophy of science. Mir Lakatos replied with the famous slogan adapted from Kant that philosophy of science without history of science is empty, and history of science without philosophy of science is blind. So by these two figures, and of course there are many more to be named, there became a profound awareness that history and philosophy need to be closely linked. But there's a question which still has not received a sort of adequate answer or commanding a consensus even to the present day, which is how can integrated HPS actually work? Or in other words, how is integrated HPS possible? So what is it that philosophers of science, at least, typically do? Now, of course, there's many things that philosophers do. Some types of questions are involved with metaphysics. What sorts of processes, entities, or relations make up the world at a fundamental level? Are there laws of nature, or are there just local patchworks of fact? Are social groups, organisms, ecosystems, or consciousness genuinely emergent entities? And so on. Historically oriented philosophers have been interested in different kinds of questions, namely epistemological and methodological questions. Under what conditions are we justified in accepting a theory? What methods should we employ in adjudicating between competing theories? When, if ever, are we justified in believing in unobservable entities? Now, of course, there's many more questions that have been asked, but this is just kind of a sampling of the sort of things that philosophers of science are typically interested in. So it's methodological and epistemological questions like these that historically oriented philosophers of science have traditionally tried to tackle. But in practice, it's often unclear as to what exactly historically inclined philosophers of science are trying to achieve. Are their findings meant to be descriptive or normative? So this is an ambiguity that we can find in works even today And it was certainly an ambiguity that existed even amongst the greats in our field. So just to give one example from Sandy Mitchell's 2009 book, she says, as I will discuss in this work, there is a mismatch between the current sciences of complex behaviors and standard philosophical criteria for scientific knowledge. It is my view that new approaches to knowledge and action are required to understand and manage the complexities of nature. These practices can be found in contemporary science. So this passage is not as straightforward as it possibly could be. So if there's a mismatch between philosophical theories and scientific practice, it's not always clear what that entails. Does that entail that the practice should change, or that the theory, that the philosophical theory should change? So in this case, Sandy Mitchell seems to be suggesting that the philosophical theory is the one that changed, and science needs to stay the way it is. But then it renders the question about, is she simply trying to describe scientific practice, or is she giving a normative theory? And if the philosophical theories that she's considering are normative theories, then why should they be in trouble just because scientists don't practice things the way that these theories say that they should, right? So this is just an illustration about how complicated and how messy things can be with trying to figure out the normative from the descriptive content of much of contemporary philosophy of science. So the way that we're going to try to characterize this is fairly straightforward. One, we're going to think of traditional philosophical questions, at least the kind that historically interested philosophers of science are typically interested in answer, as normative, right? And this is not, this is in keeping with certain traditions, that especially things about epistemology as fundamentally being a normative discipline. So it was one of the central ideas of the historicist tradition that to shed light on these methodological questions, one had to consult the history of science. So we couldn't figure out whether justification or how we should justify theories merely by reflecting on logical relations between theory and evidence. That consultation with the history of science became an indispensable strategy in trying to uncover proper norms. Historians are typically interested in different sets of questions, like what were the beliefs, methods, and practices of the relevant historical ages? How exactly did those beliefs, methods, and practices change during the period under study? What factors contributed to transitions in those beliefs, methods, and practices? So these are fundamentally descriptive questions. So we still have an open question, which is, how do these descriptive historical questions relate to the normative philosophical questions that philosophers are often interested in? So Kuhn says, once we understand how and why science work, it must necessarily have implications for the way scientists should behave if their enterprises flourish. Lakatos took a different approach. He claimed that different methodological dicta ought to be tested against intuitively selective historical transitions that we all consider or all agree are rational. But still there remains a big question, right? Which is, how can one draw normative methodological or philosophical conclusions from descriptive historical findings? So Kuhn's account and Lakatos's account, amongst others, have been found wanting in providing a satisfactory answer to this question, right? So how is it that these two different sets of questions can bear relation to one? So in the traditional historicist meta-methodology, a methodology was to be tested against a set of rational or progressive historical transitions. So this was fundamentally a question about, how is it that we go about evaluating normative philosophical claims? So this is what meta-methodology is about. And one traditional way to do it is by testing it against historical transitions that we pre-theoretically think are rational or progressive, right? So for example, from geocentrism to heliocentrism, from Aristotelian to Cartesian natural philosophy, from classical mechanics to general relativity, and so on, right? So we would want our methodologies, our normative accounts, to somehow capture these transitions that we take as exemplifying progress in some sense, right? So we have changes in beliefs as time goes on, but each of those is going to be evaluated by a single methodology, right? So a methodology would be acceptable only if its normative verdicts coincided by and large by those made by actual scientists. So one assumption underlying this approach was the idea that the pre-selected cases of transitions is genuinely representative of the general population of transitions, right? So one issue is that if you build up a theory of scientific method from a couple of transitions that it seems to fit, how do we know that this is a general theory that is going to account for future transitions? How do we know that it's going to account for other transitions that we haven't tested it to yet? Moreover, and I think one of the ways in which we depart from these kind of classical approaches is this assumption is based on a more fundamental assumption that theories are evaluated by a fixed scientific method, a set of universal criteria for theory evaluation. So the idea is we have some sort of methodology, and only scientific theories or maybe research programs or paradigms are the kinds of things that are changing. Right? While the method of evaluation was thought to be immune from change, that is to say, scientific progress is kind of irrelevant to progress in the methodological philosophical realm. So in this view, the acceptance of new theories and therefore scientific change was driven by this unchanging universal method that stayed consistently with science throughout its history. And the key task of HPS on this view is to explicate what this method is by studying exemplars of good science and then prescribing them for future employment. However, historical as well as philosophical research showed by 1980 at least that there is no fixed method of science. Methods do change. So one thing that we have found is that for all of these purported universal methods, scientific practice has frequently, or at least sometimes, flouted those rules and progressed in its stead. But still, one other further discovery is that the methods that scientists are employing to evaluate their theories are the kinds of things that change as their theories change, right? So there are transitions in theory evaluation that happen as scientific knowledge changes. This means that methods are not something external to the process of scientific change. Right? They are the kinds of things that change through time, as well as other scientific elements. So while most philosophers of science seem to agree that there is no fixed method of science, it is still quite common for a contemporary essay to generalize from a handful of in-depth case studies and draw methodological conclusions. Right? So this case study approach has raised some eyebrows, more skeptical eyebrows, and specifically has led to accusations of cherry-picking historical cases to warrant foregone methodological conclusions. So the worry is that somebody picks out a transition or a specific historical episode that conveniently illustrates one's philosophical theory, and we don't know that this is not just a description of a very specific historical time period. So Haslak-Chain, for example, says, what can we conclude from a mere handful of case studies? The field of HPS has witnessed too many hasty philosophical generalizations based on a small number of conveniently chosen case studies. I believe that the neglect to clarify the nature of the history-philosophy relationship in case studies has contributed decisively to a widespread disillusion with the whole HPS enterprise. And Haslak-Chain, being a huge not only supporter, but an inspiration of our movement, is making a point that we completely agree with, is that if we want to do HPS effectively, this case study approach seems extremely limited in what it can teach us. So we hold that, as a rule, one cannot generalize from case studies and conclude from those generalizations that those case studies are exemplary of the general population. Any generalization from case studies concerning normative methodological dicta can be, at best, at a very, very low level. It's most surprising, therefore, that many analytic philosophers these days opt to engage in a brand of philosophy of science as anything but historical. If one wants to answer these kind of traditional philosophical questions, and one doesn't want to just say particular points about a very particular historical agent in a very particular setting, it makes sense to kind of move away or step away from the messiness of history and kind of move back to a kind of pre-Kuhnian approach to philosophy, right? So this was famously summarized by Karl Popper in a view that maybe some still have sympathy with. The whole of science may err. Appeals to scientific practice are nothing more for Popper than dogmatic appeals to authority, right? So it's a fallacious reasoning to engage in kind of historical philosophy of science in the first place. And the kind of complexity of history has maybe caused a shift among some philosophers to move back in this direction. But this can lead to the unsatisfactory conclusion that philosophies of science may have absolutely nothing to do with science itself. Philosophical positions without any contact with the history of science, or at least current scientific practices, would be mere castles in the air, to use an expression from Paul Feyerabend, right? The idea is we're doing philosophy of science. We want to say something about an actual practice, right? And we don't know by merely doing philosophical reflection that our imaginings have any relevance to the material of which they are supposed to be about and contribute to. So this approach, despite the motivations that it might have, seems unsatisfying. So traditional approaches to HPS seem to be facing the following dilemma. Is it possible to draw methodological conclusions from the history of science? If the answer is yes, then we focus entirely locally on historical methodologies. This is maybe what might be called the particular swing, where lots of people refrain from making generalized statements about science and instead focus on very, very local practices and focus on what Clifford Geertz called thick descriptions of individual cases. So people who have kind of accepted the complexity and messiness of history, but want to remain historical, have adopted this particularist kind of approach. Another way is to adopt a universal anti-historicist methodology, which is to say that the history of science is simply not relevant to methodological or philosophical conclusions. So it's unclear as to how exactly these local histories or methodologies can have any normative bearing on future science. This is a point made really well by Dudley Shapiro. If science is the kind of thing that's changing, then we can't automatically generalize from past instances of scientific practice to future ones, or even necessarily to contemporary ones. If things are historically in flux, then these kind of generalizations through induction just don't work because the subject material itself is changing, right? So given that we're thinking about these normative kind of questions, it's not clear that these local historical methodologies, no matter how careful they might be to local cases, can actually have normative content for directing future scientific research. And as mentioned before, with the universal anti-historicist methodology, it's unclear how such a methodology could have anything to do with actual scientific practice. And it certainly at least allows for that possibility, right? So our diagnosis is that both of the approaches that have taken a lot of airspace are untenable, since they effectively disregard the existence of general descriptive questions about scientific change. And that's where we think one of our key contributions lies. So we think that it isn't just descriptive historical and normative methodological questions that are at stake when doing HPS. There's a third group of questions, namely descriptive questions concerning the general mechanism of scientific change. So what exactly does this mean? Well, let's start with a few examples of questions that we might ask in this domain. What's the mechanism of theory acceptance, or what are the mechanisms of theory acceptance? What's the underlying dynamics of method employment? You're going to hear a lot more about these, especially in Paul and Hackett's talks. How does the theory or method rejection take place? What are the basic types of elements that can undergo scientific change? What are the types of epistemic stances that an epistemic agent can take towards an epistemic element? What type of epistemic agents can there be? Now, by the end of this winter school, you'll be thoroughly schooled in what a lot of these terms mean. But for now, this is just an idea of a kind of smattering of questions that fall under this rubric of descriptive questions concerning general mechanisms of scientific change. So some of these questions concern the dynamics. What is it that's causing changes to happen in beliefs of historical agents? Other questions concern the ontology of scientific change. What are the kinds of things that are participating in these historical changes? And what roles do they play? So there are three distinct groups of questions which, albeit interconnected, concern different aspects of scientific change. So normative questions concerning methods of theory evaluation and practice that ought to take place in science. Descriptive questions concerning the peculiarities of theories, methods, and practices in individual historical episodes. And descriptive questions concerning ontology and dynamics of changes in theories, methods, and practice. Right? So what Sea Autonomy is doing is fundamentally a descriptive enterprise, but it's a descriptive enterprise of a different sort, right? What we're doing is we're trying to populate an ontology. We're trying to populate a unified language, if you will, of the kinds of things that are participating in historical changes and historical instances of science, right? And then also what we're trying to provide is a sense of dynamics, right? Why do things change in the way that they do? And are there patterns in the ways in which these transitions take place, right? So these are descriptive questions, but they are not mainly just simply kind of looking at, going to the archives and trying to set up a description of an individual case. They are different in kind, but we believe complementary in a broader approach to HBS. So obviously on the right here, we have the traditional normative questions. So these are the questions concerning methodology, or what philosophical methodological questions kind of look like. Descriptive questions about what actually happened in particular cases, or what happened during certain transitions, is a task for historians of science. And we believe that the key to our conundrum is this group of questions, and this is where Sea Autonomy lies. So many integrated HBS projects take the hasty approach by trying to answer all of these questions in one sitting, right? So they're extremely ambitious. They want to set up a philosophical theory of methodology. They want to do the history of science, and they also want to have a clear ontology and a clear kind of theory or meta theory about what was going on in that episode or that transition. And they want to do this all by themselves in a single paper under 10,000 words. So it's quite common in integrated HBS to delve into a certain historical episode and then make some quasi-general claims about the working of science. So we think that attempts to do what Sea Autonomy is trying to do are already present in the literature. They are normally just done in kind of a haphazard sort of way, right? So oftentimes you'll see after the case study various kinds of remarks that will suggest that there's some degree of generalizability from that case study, and that there's kind of a stable set of ontology or dynamics that they are working with when evaluating that case study. And then finally, they're going to end with some sort of philosophical lesson that we're all supposed to learn, all in a single paper. So we believe in a more piecemeal and systematic approach, since not much can be learned about scientific change from any one episode, right? So a single historical case study on its own is not going to teach us much about anything but that historical case study. To avoid cherry picking and hasty conclusions, we need a solid body of historical data to draw on for general conclusions about the underlying mechanism of scientific change. So one thing David had mentioned, and it's going to come up a little bit more, is if in order to answer questions about what is the ontology of scientific change, what are the dynamics, are there patterns? If so, what are those patterns? What are those domains in which they work, right? In order to answer these without cherry picking, we need a large body of historical data. And that's one thing that Sea Autonomy hopes to provide. Methodological prescriptions, if any, can only be drawn once we have solid knowledge about how history works. So methodology is kind of something that comes at the end of the road, once we have both understandings of the particulars of case studies that we're interested in evaluating, as well as a general descriptive kind of theory that would come from a practice like scientonomy. Okay, so question. How can we arrive at a solid knowledge of the workings of science? How could we actually arrive at the kind of knowledge that scientonomy would be able to contribute to answer the kind of challenges that have been raised against HPS? So the history of HPS shows that individual historic episodes to understand scientific change are not the best approach. They typically fall, and they typically fail, right? This is to be expected, right? It isn't that the heroes of our field aren't extremely talented historians. They certainly were. They were incredibly well read. I don't know where they got the time to read all that they did, and be able to give some analysis of wide diversity of practices. But at the end of the day, doing a general history of science is very complicated and very difficult, right? And no individual, no matter how brilliant, is likely to just kind of be able to do that on their own. Moreover, anybody who tries to do it needs to recognize that we're probably going to be wrong, right? Like, new research is constantly uncovering new historical facts that lead to changes in our ontology or our understanding of dynamics of scientific change. So what we suppose our suggest instead is a new communal approach where we advance our understanding of the workings of science in an iterative, piecemeal, and transparent fashion. So what scientonomy does not do versus what scientonomy does do. So we do not aim at prescribing any normative methodology. Such might be a conclusion that could be inferred from scientonomy as well as the history of science. This is how scientonomy contributes to the traditional mission of HPS, but scientonomy on its own does not aim at prescribing normative methods. Scientonomy does attempt to unearth the general mechanism of scientific change. How is it that epistemic elements change through time? We do not presuppose any fixed and universal method of science. Methods can be incredibly local, ephemeral, and very specific to circumstance. That is something perfectly compatible with scientonomy. Rather, we want to understand those methods, however many there are. How is it that they change through time? We do not try to shoehorn historical case studies into the confines of our preferred methodology. Rather, we iteratively adjust its general hypotheses or general scientonomic hypotheses to do better justice to historical episodes. So we really want to underline the idea here is that the particularist move in contemporary HPS and philosophy of science is not intrinsically at odds with what we're trying to do in scientonomy. Right? We are entirely open to most forms of the so-called disunity of science hypothesis, right? That theories can be incredibly local about very specific events, and so too can methods, right? That is something that we're perfectly happy to accept. The question isn't whether there's one method or 372,242 methods, right? The question is, how is it that these things change through time, right? And as fallibilists, we know that our general hypotheses are imperfect and revisable. And so the best we can do is try to change them as we confront new historical evidence. And this facilitates iterative advancement and avoids cherry picking. We can have developed a special workflow. Right? So this is the workflow that we've been incorporating into our practice. So it starts with the encyclopedia. The encyclopedia kind of looks like Wikipedia. It fixes the current state of knowledge, that is, what do we accept as a community, and keeps track of modifications. And so we track our own history about how our scientonomic knowledge has changed throughout time. We then try to scrutinize the knowledge that's in this encyclopedia through seminars. This is attempts to detect flaws in our current knowledge and pose questions. We then have a journal which publishes papers which suggest modifications to our scientonomy knowledge. So the seminars become kind of a brainstorming network to scrutinize maybe what's wrong or what can be extended with our current knowledge, And then these are followed through more carefully and specifically with journal publications that go through standard peer review. Afterwards, we have a workshop. So the papers themselves do not change our knowledge. Rather, we talk about the contents of the paper and attempt to reach a consensus through workshops like ones we're going to have after this, after the winter school. So this workflow, we think, has several advantages. So we know at any given point where we currently stand, right? It's really hard to know what do philosophers believe about topic X. That's a very tricky thing to figure out. Whereas in our case, there's just a website that you can go to look at it. By documenting open questions, it helps identify new promising avenues of research. It facilitates a piecemeal advancement of communal knowledge through the mechanism of suggested modifications. So we aren't starting from scratch for each paper. And it guarantees that all of our changes are communal and that our changes in knowledge are transparent. That is, they are inclusive of everyone who's in the community who wishes to participate. So the traditional workflow, it's kind of publication-centric, which we all know kind of way too well, right? So first it starts with submitting a paper, then it goes under peer review. It might get rejected. You might get revisions or accepted, and then it goes to publishing. But if it gets rejected, most of the time it ends up in a desk drawer somewhere, never to be seen again in print. So whatever knowledge might have been gained from that paper is kind of lost and forgotten. But even if it does get see the light of day in publishing, most published papers at the end do not actually get read all that much, right? They end up in the archives of the journals, only never to be retrieved again. So in both cases, we have a huge amount of inefficiency with the traditional workflow. So there's an increased sense that traditional workflow must be revised. So there's massive amounts of commentaries on open science, on peer review, the idea that the scientific paper is an obsolete kind of practice, right? That open archives are maybe a better way to go. And historical research has suggested that the scientific journal arose in a kind of context that isn't really relevant anymore. So there's a lot of people who have kind of already noted that there are these problems with the traditional workflow of the humanities. So what's wrong with it? Well, a few things. One is the fate of ideas. When a paper is published, it is often unclear whether its suggestions are accepted by the community or whether they are merely pursuit-worthy, right? What do we change our beliefs as a result of this paper, or are these merely interesting food for thought? As a result, the fate of the published idea often remains unknown. So we just don't know what implications that research ended up having. It kind of goes into the void. There's also a lack of transparency. The traditional workflow doesn't offer a simple way of knowing what's accepted and what isn't accepted by a given epistemic community at a time. We believe that this stems from a much deeper problem. Right? So what is the purpose of peer review? So it's not clear what the end goal of peer review is. Are submissions evaluated for acceptability? That is, they contribute acceptable knowledge that we ought to take seriously, or pursuit worthiness? Are they evaluated just because they contain interesting ideas which might be stimulatory? The traditional goal of peer review could be evaluating for acceptance or evaluating for pursuit only. And if it's published, then we can read the claims of that paper as reflecting accepted knowledge. If it's published, we just merely know that we think that those ideas are pursuit-worthy. In some fields of inquiry, we equate published with acceptance, right? Especially in biomedicine. In other fields, published means that you have one generous editor and one generous reviewer at least. Right? However, in many fields, it's not clear, even for reviewers themselves, whether the goal of review is to evaluate for acceptance or pursuit. Right, so here's an example on one of my old papers from my two reviewers. One reviewer says, this paper contains a lot of very good expositions. It shows very knowledgeable treatment of Feyerabend's work and argumentation style. I definitely would like to see it published, right? This doesn't say that anything I said was right, but it just seems to say that there is some value to it and therefore it's pursuit-worthy. The other reviewer, who's more critical, said, without a decent social epistemology, Feyerabend cannot productively conceive of or contribute to the issues about dissent. I do not recommend this paper for publications. So in that case, they think that The paper just cannot contribute to building acceptable knowledge on a specific topic. Okay, so both horns of these dilemma we think are problematic. If it's accepted, we have a lack of inclusivity. A few peer reviewers and editors get to decide the fate of an idea rather than the community at large. If it's pursued, we get a lack of evaluation, and the fate of published ideas often remains unknown. We don't want to just continue pursuing forever. We also want to eventually come to certain beliefs about things. So both of these approaches seem kind of worrisome. In this scenario, the community at large has virtually no say in the acceptance of ideas in their field. In this scenario, there is no piecemeal post-factum evaluation mechanism, and the fate of published ideas remains unknown. So the traditional workflow has various drawbacks. It lacks transparency because there's no simple way of knowing what's accepted and what isn't accepted by a community. Unclear goal of peer review. If reviewers evaluate for acceptance, then the workflow is not inclusive because a few peer reviewers and editor get to decide the fate of ideas. And published equals not accepted, then we have no piecemeal evaluation mechanism. So there should be a better way, and there is our way. So we need a new workflow that will satisfy the following requirements. We need it to be transparent, so we need a simple way to know what is accepted and what isn't. We need to have clear goal for peer review, both for the reviewers and for people writing the paper. We need to have an ability to determine the fate inclusively through a community. And we need piecemeal evaluation. We need ways of allowing for changes in our knowledge to happen in kind of a straightforward way. So the scientonomic workflow that we've been developing since 2016 aims to meet these requirements. So we already kind of went through the four main components, right? The wiki is where we think we facilitate transparency because we know exactly where we stand. The seminar gives us an ability to actually critically evaluate that so we don't treat our knowledge, our scientonomic knowledge dogmatically. The journal is something that tries to answer open questions and suggest modifications. So these are promising areas that we think are worthy of getting into a full paper about. And then we have a communal way of deciding what to do with the idea suggested in that paper. So we know where we stand. Then we identify limitations. We then propose modifications. And then we discuss those modifications with the goal of reaching consensus. Great. So as I mentioned, the main goal of the encyclopedia is to document our current knowledge on scientific change. Right? This is kind of what it looks like. So if you go down to accepted theories, it will tell you exactly what kinds of theories we accept. And you can click around on these to learn more about their content, right? So the current views are summarized in tables like this one. So these are just more examples, and you'll become more familiar with the exact content of these as we go along. That's how we know where we currently stand. Once we know where we stand, we can then scrutinize and identify open questions. So traditionally, formulating open questions has been the main goal of scientonomy. So many of the talks, rapid talks we'll see tomorrow, were projects that came out of this kind of practice, right? Out of these seminars, so here's an example of a seminar we had in 2019, we get a bunch of questions, right? And these questions we think are pursuit-worthy. So we put them up on the website and we document all of the open questions that we think are valuable or potentially valuable. Any one of those questions can become a fruitful topic for a research paper to develop it in depth. Each paper of the journal is an attempt to answer at least one question and suggest at least one modification to our knowledge. All right, so here's an example of what things would look like in our journal, where you can just kind of open it up. Just a general idea what it looks like. And at the very end of each paper, you can see what modifications are being suggested by that paper. Once the paper is published, the suggested modifications are properly documented in the encyclopedia so they can be evaluated by the community at large. And they are properly linked, the journal and the encyclopedia, to a proper page where we can then discuss it. Right? The verdict is always, whether it's accepted or rejected, will always be made public. In order to know why, we scroll down and we will see the rationale or the decision that was made and why it was made. Right? Now, who gets to decide whether the modifications in these papers actually get accepted? Well, the community, and the community as a whole. Right? So there is a discussion forum which you can add comments to and have discussions. Any registered user of the encyclopedia can leave comments on this point, and the goal is to reach a consensus. If the community agrees that the modification is acceptable, then the verdict is documented and the verdict's rationale is recorded. Right? If it's not acceptable, we still document it as well as the verdict for why it was rejected. But what happens if there's no consensus? And this is something that happens decently frequently. Then the modification becomes subject of a focused workshop discussion, which is what we're going to see in live action later this week, or at least some of us. When a consensus is finally reached, our respective pages in the encyclopedia are modified to reflect changes in our mosaic. Workshop discussions have been published and the results have been registered in the encyclopedia. So here is just kind of what it looks like. You see all the authors were all the people who contributed in the discussion. We took votes. We can see what the votes were. You can look at the dialogue in order to see what the back and forth was kind of like. Right. In the upcoming 3-day workshop, we are planning to discuss a few dozen modifications that have accumulated over the years. The advantages, we know where we stand. We have very specific mechanisms for identifying drawbacks or limitations in our current knowledge. It facilitates an iterative, piecemeal advancement to our communal knowledge. And it guarantees that changes in the mosaic are transparent. We always know why we changed what we changed, right? So we are the opposite of the traditional workflow. We have a simple way of knowing what's accepted and what's not accepted. We have clear goals for review. Reviewers and editors only evaluate for pursuit. The fate of an idea is decided inclusively. And we allow for piecemeal evaluations, right? So, sorry, I'm kind of running low on time. I'm really quickly going to go through our history here. The first version of the theory was published in Hackub's book in 2015, and we've been detecting flaws in it ever since. The idea of the workflow came in 2016, and that's when the encyclopedia was established. The first issue of the journal came in 2017, as well as the idea of creating a database of intellectual history, right? The Scientonomy ontology was updated to include questions. And sorry, I'm going to move through these relatively quickly. We had our first conference in Toronto in 2019, and we've been changing our beliefs in various ways. We've developed a new diagrammatic notation that Kai is going to talk about, new definitions, new articles that are constantly coming out, conference proceedings. The structure of the encyclopedia was modified. Izzy's going to talk a little bit about that. And then our first workshop in 2023, as well as our workshop here in Lisbon.